I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the Art of Life H3O show, and that's backwards because it's the H3O Art of Life show.
Right.
But the title of this show is Framing Reality, the Role of Propaganda. And I have two very good people here who I claim as my children, so this is Take Your Children to Work Week. And I'm having them to talk to you about this subject because they will know far more about it than I do, which makes me very happy that they are my guests. And I will start with Hunter Havlin Adams III, and then I will go to Dr. Joseph Ben Levi, and I will start with Hunter only because it was Hunter's idea that we get into this. So I'm going to say that I want Hunter to, I know he has an opening statement he wants to make, but somewhere in this opening statement, Hunter, I want you to include an excerpt that you have from your upcoming book, We Were Never Slaves. And that excerpt has to do about the stories, the 5 stories or the 4 stories. So if you would please refer to that, because I think for me, propaganda is about propagation. And propagation is the widespread distribution of false information. You know, well, for me it is, you know, it's not a pejorative term in just that sense. You can propagate something that is actually true. But the theory that about most of the theories about African people promulgated by non-African people have been in error, and they have been purposefully done, and consequently I think of propaganda always in the negative. So I want you to talk about the stories that other people tell about us, as well as the stories that we tell about ourselves and to ourselves, as you somewhere over in your presentation. Now I will stand down.
Oh, thank you so very much for having me as a guest on your show. Again, I'm always delighted to be here and offer some contribution to your listeners, that we have to really pay attention to things. And you talk about stories. The idea of of stories is really crucial, because whoever tells your story, that's going to be how you live your life. So you have to ask yourself, who's telling your story and why? It's so important, because if someone can tell your story about you, about your history, then they have control over your future. It doesn't seem, does that seem reasonable? Well, some will say no. But here's the thing. The movie Black Panther by Ryan Coogler, who directed it, it told a different story of African people that before that we had never seen before. Because our stories always reference what I call a rogue reality, that a reality where African people are always depicted miserable, dejected, disenfranchised, depressed, decadent, all the D words, and there's many more, right? But his film didn't show African people as that at all, right? You didn't see African people colonized. You didn't see African people as, quote, captives, which some people say slaves. You didn't see African people who were subservient to someone else, in that they had their own, these 5 ethnic groups in the film Black Panther had their own economies. They were trading amongst themselves. Right? They didn't need to trade with anyone else. They knew the other world existed, but they were doing fine by themselves. their idea of their history, of their origin story, was not reference to anyone else, not reference to Europeans, not reference to Arabs, not reference to Asians. They had their own origin story, which was talked about in that opening montage of about 6 minutes. And they said a meteorite hit Africa, and then you see 5 hands come out the sand, locked. They were together. So what did that say? It reset time. It said African people were the first people. But that's not the story that we get. We get a story told by someone else about us, where our history, our humanity has been erased, or it's been covered up or misused, abused. Now people will say our history is fake news because Hegel said Africans didn't have any history, right? Didn't have any history at all. We had never contributed anything to humanity. How can that be? You have the Chief Supreme Court Justice, Roger Taney, in the Dred Scott decision, make a claim without evidence that these blacks are beings of an inferior order. Without evidence. And that statement has never been annulled, overruled, or challenged yet. It's still United States law that African people, black people, descendants of the captives today, are beings of an inferior order. And they were never meant to be a part of this political experiment. That's someone else's story. The guy made an assertion without evidence. It was an opinion, just like the totality of what the Dred Scott versus Sanford case was an opinion. But it's never been challenged. And so we're still looked at today where we've been framed, Dr. Peace, as being less than human. It's in the Bible. Slaves, Ephesians, slaves, obey your masters. But that story was changed too. Because, I talk about this in the book, the new politicals, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, and so forth, they wanted to print their own Bibles, the King James Bible here. But George III says, no, you must buy your Bibles from me. This is the expert here, Dr. Levi. He can correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
right?
No, because Jefferson made his own Bible.
Right? And so when they, after 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, they said, bump you, King. We're going to print our own Bibles. It'll be the King James Authorized Version. But it's been Americanized, and 100 verses have been mistranslated. They've been mistranslated. From, Moses parted the Red Sea. It was the Reed Sea.
Right.
It wasn't red, it was the Reed Sea.
Right.
It was a sea of reeds, so you could just walk through there. And so we've been susceptible to this propaganda, right? Statements that are made or assertions that are made without a factual basis. Former presidential candidate Herman Cain, the pizza man, he said, he was honest, I don't have facts to back this up. But he said it anyway. And so that's what we get. We get all these assertions about us. They're wrong stories. There's someone else telling our story. So we have to tell our own stories. I say that we were never slaves. That's the title of my book. We should never, ever use that term to refer to our ancestors. They were captives, prisoners of war. And even the Spanish and the Portuguese said so themselves. These Africans were ransom captives. They were kidnapped, stolen, and held for ransom until somebody paid the ransom, whoever that might have been. Whether some wealthy family in Lisbon or wherever, they had to pay the ransom. The word slave was invented. It's a trick. It really referred to Slav. We talked about this before. But they put a diacritical mark over the A, right, to change the pronunciation. And since people didn't know what that meant, they put an E on the end, the British did, to make it slave. So you would know that this is differentiating Eastern European Slavic people from Africans. Because Slavs, for a number of centuries, maybe 12th through the 16th century, they were the ones who were being abducted in the Holy Roman Empire. They were outside of the Roman Empire, and I got this on the authority from a Czech when I had a dinner at the Czech Council in Chicago. He gave me the whole history. Blew me away. Even people say, oh, we weren't slaves, we were enslaved. Well, enslaved comes from enclave or enclave. Clavis.
That's clavis.
Right? Meaning you're under lockdown. And so the Slavic people were on lockdown by the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto. Right? They were prisoners of war in their own land. So we got all this wrong, Dr. Peace. Can you help me out? Can we get this straight?
We're here to try to get some propaganda examined, and we're going to get Ben Levi to hold it down for another minute and a half.
Okay. Well,
Good opening, though, Hunter.
yes, sure was. Because my approach to it is going to be very closely his, in that one of the biggest examples of propaganda that we've dealt with over the years is the idea of the coming apocalypse. The idea that this 1,000-year reign of Christ is going to occur, and afterwards there's going to be this rapture, and there's going to be 1,000 years of peace and all this. And what's really interesting is that the Pew Research Center just did a study showing that most Americans, i.e. white Americans, are moving away from the church. But black people are coming more and more and more to it. And oftentimes they're failing to realize that, one, way back when in this was about the 16th century, there was this Benedictine nun. Her name was Hildegard Bergen. Hildegard was arguing that the problem, the notion of apocalypse, the problem of the so-called Antichrist was really the church. Now, the problem with the idea of the Antichrist, or the Antichristo, that is, the one who is against the anointed, what that idea really comes from is the fact that in the early development of the church, when they were debating over text, because we got to remember that the early New Testament, the earliest one, the Muratorian canon, only had Mark and the letters of Paul in it. That was it. It didn't have all the stuff we had. It wasn't until 364 or so, when Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria comes out and does his Easter speech, that they lay out the 27 books that are in there now, and nobody ever questioned it. But what they were also doing was suppressing another story.
That's right.
The other story, which is told by the people that they refer to as the Gnostics, now they have many different names, the Valentians, the people who follow Basilides, and a whole group of these people, they were arguing that first off, there was no such thing as a Jesus. That this person they call Jesus, who is really called Yeshua, you know, we think about this term Yeshua as if it was a unique name. But Yeshua was as easy as finding my name, Josef, out there. There were thousands of people with that name. If you were to stand in the forum and holler out, "Hey, Jesus." Hell, it probably been about 300 people who stood up. So you talking to me? Not only that, the notion that he was born of Joseph. See, this is a different story because originally it says that Mark says he was born of Mary. Well, technically in that part of the world at the time, you couldn't say that a man was born of a woman because that meant that he didn't have a father. That was really, really problematic. But people have believed, really going back to roughly 999 or so, that this apocalypse was going to occur in the year 1000. When it didn't happen, they changed the story. And one of the ways that they changed the story is that they, one, changed the date, but then that was problematic because no one knew what that date was. And when Dionysius Exiguus, who was a Cilician monk, came up with the idea, what we think of as BC AD, because he did that, he was some 4 to 6 years off. And see, most people don't think about the fact that while we call this the year 2018, when was year one and for whom? Because there were other calendars that people were following. And so, if we were to accept the fact that the way that he constructed the calendar was 4 to 6 years off, then this is really not the year 2018, is it? There are many, many, many times when we had these problems of these apocalyptic dates. When we look at, say, the year 1099, that was a very important date. They thought that the apocalypse was going to happen then, the Norman invasion. Mm-hmm. It didn't. When Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, defeated Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and unified the kingdom, what became known as the Pax Romana. He was given the title Soter. Soter in Greek means savior, because there was peace throughout the world. Now, Suetonius, Plutarch, Tacitus, many of these ancient writers all talked about the importance of saviors at their time. This was before Jesus was even thought of coming into the existence. You also had people like Apollonius of Tyana. All right. Now, this individual had all of the characteristics of, and Philostratus wrote about this, of all the characteristics that we typically ascribe to Jesus. And he was on record as having done these things. We have no records of this so-called Jesus performing all these miracles and stuff. On top of that, the people where he lived in Galilee, which was to be like from the hood. If you come from Galilee, I mean, that was the worst place to come from. Most of the people of that time didn't believe him. See, the way the story got to make him be believed to be the Messiah and all this kind of stuff was something that was created much, much later when the texts were worked out. And we don't see this occurring until roughly 336, when Constantine, this is after the Council of Nicaea in 325, right, where they actually established this individual Jesus as the Son of God and all this kind of stuff and having the same substance as God. They decide then, and he puts out an edict, to go out and find all of the other material that is written contrary, anti-Christ, and having it burned. Not only that, to have the people who wrote them destroyed, to have them killed. So you have powerful people like Arius. Arius was one of the people who was one of the African bishops at the Council of Nicaea, who made the argument that it is impossible for God to be considered a man or to be like a man. But the powers in the church at that time made the argument, well, we're going to make it like this. And they argued over a Greek word. homoousia. You know, the same, a man's substance, homo man ousia substance. And what they did was they put an iota in the word homoousia to mean like the same substance as God. And so consequently, they established what they called the Nicene Creed at that time. And from that day forward, this individual became a superhero. You know, he was like this godlike being, even though throughout the world at that time there were many, many, many savior type deities. This is why when Paul goes to all these people and tell them about this special person with had these godlike figures, they could relate to that. They all had these type of special gods who were born of virgins, who were died and were resurrected. They knew, they were familiar, but they were good with that. But what he did was brought in a new kind of idea. So that carried on for a long time. Now, let me run this up bring it up to the United States. When we come to the United States, when you get people like Cotton Mather in the early days, and particularly William Miller, I want to take him because he's the foundation of a lot of this stuff that we call the evangelical movement. See, they didn't have any evangelicals back then. William Miller believed in this notion of dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is the idea that the world has gone through 7 different dispensations or 7 different time periods, and the last time period was going to happen about 1833. And so he had sat around and made all these calculations and predicted that this day was going to come when Jesus was going to return, and people were selling off their stuff, dressing in white, sitting up on a mountain, waiting for Jesus to return. Guess what? It didn't happen. So he said, I must have gotten it all wrong. So he went back and recalculated and said it'd be the next year, 1834. Nothing happened. And so then there was a big split, and that split turned into the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. You know, the word Advent means like a returning arrival. They translated it to mean the return of Jesus Christ. It's just like the Greek word parousia. Parousia means arrival, to return. They made that mean the arrival of Jesus Christ. Now, that's not what it says, but that's how they work with words, right?
Right.
And so people after that were a little discouraged. But then around 1899, see, all the 99 years are very important. 1899, people started then again predicting that this world-changing event would occur, and the Civil War was a part of the apocalyptic movement toward that. Well, that didn't happen. So 1900 occurred, everything was fine, and then we started getting lots and lots and lots and lots of stories about the possibility of the world coming to an end, and particularly 1948. Now, in 1948, some people who were off in Europe, who were called the Jews, after the Balfour Declaration under Great Britain and the establishment of the Jewish mandate in Palestine, were allowed to go to a land where they told them this is a land without some people and this is some people without a land. Of course, there were people who were there, Palestinians. For American evangelicals, people like Billy Graham, this was a sign that the end was near because the Jews are returning to the land and now we can get ready for this great apocalypse that's going to occur. Well, it didn't. And so they started changing the story again. They recalculated. So we had people who were predicting that it was going to happen in 1977. We had people predicting that it was going to happen in 2012, December 21st, 2012, the Mayan calendar, right? Even though they never asked any Mayan priest what they thought about that. And when they asked the Mayan priests about December 21st, 2012, they said that we never heard anything like that. But a lot of people made a lot of money off of it.
They made money.
A lot of money off of it. And because all over the History Channel and Discovery Channel, you had these people on there, you know, all these white so-called archaeologists and stuff predicted that they figured out what the Mayan calendar has said, but nobody ever went to the Mayapan in the Yucatan and ask the Mayan priest what they thought about that. You see, and this is again a propaganda game. And then guess what? December 20, I was teaching my class. I told my students, I'll see y'all next week. Because December 21st came and went. And you didn't hear anything else about it. Now, to bring it a little further, 1999. What was the big event then? Which played into the Y2K, right?
Y2K.
Predicting that this is going to be this is it. This is the end of the world leading to 2000. You got to keep in mind now, nobody knows what the real date is. And so we've established this particular date. So I remember distinctly that I was working in information systems at the time. I was a network administrator, and I had a special project that I got paid a nice piece of money for, to go to work at the Tribune Tower, to sit in the computer room and watch the clock. That's all I had to do. And I did. And when the clock ticked over, you know, January 1st, 2000, I went up on the roof with everybody else and watched the fireworks and had me some champagne. And the interesting thing about that day, I'll never forget, is that this is December 31st, and it is 65 degrees outside on this day. Nothing happened. All right. Now, what we find is that when these things occur, you find people readjusting the script and starting to say other types of things. But this has been going on for a long, long time. And what comes out of this is a propaganda machine that boosts the church and boosts, because around these times, membership in churches explode. Because everybody is hoping that something is going to happen. But what they're not told is that the text itself does not talk about the historical Jesus. And no ministers address the historical Jesus. They can talk about the Christ. The Christ is a theoretical construct. Christ means to be anointed, to have oil poured upon you. There's no something. Jesus' last day wasn't Christ like mine, Joseph ben Levi. But it's an easy way for them to play the game, because you can preach on that. Second, I can always preach on metaphors. And of course you have people out there, I'm sure, that say, well, in the book of Revelations it says this, and in Daniel it says that. Yeah, but if you don't know ancient history, you don't know that the fourth beast coming up out of the sea have nothing to do with what's going on here, because there was no America at that time. It wasn't even thought about. But people like to think that when the lion comes up and his wings get plucked off, the lion is Great Britain, when the wings get plucked off and they fly over to America, that's America. You know, you can do anything metaphorically you want with prophecy. But unless you really know the history, and not only that, many prophets are what I like to call Monday morning quarterbacks. All right, they saw the game, and then the next day they have a discussion about it, and about who they thought should have won and how it should have been won and so forth and so on. But they are not really speaking to the actual event that occurs. And this is one of the problems that we have. And I'm not saying there aren't things in the Bible that aren't really historical. One of the really fundamental historical things, and then I'm going to be quiet, let Hunter jump into this, is this. Hezekiah. And this goes to Isaiah and to Matthew. When Matthew says, a virgin shall conceive seed and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. Quoting from Isaiah 7:14. Well, the Greek word parthenos, which means virgin, is not in Isaiah. The Hebrew word for virgin is betula. It doesn't say, and in there it says alma, it means a young woman. And when they're reading that, they're just taking that one passage, but they're not going up to the top and reading where the prophet Isaiah is speaking to Ahaz and telling him about Remaliah and Peck and all these people who are going to come in and create these problems. You should read that in the book of 2 Kings, in roughly the 14th chapter and so forth, where Hezekiah shows up. Isaiah shows up and is talking to Ahaz, who has a son whose name is Hezekiah. And in it, it says, and God was with him. That's what the word in Hebrew, Emmanuel, means. And God was with him. And so what they did was apply that to Jesus, just snatched it out and applied it to him, but it had nothing at all to do with Jesus. But they were making a story. And again, propaganda at work.
Well, here's what we got going right now is the greatest story ever told, spiritually, and the greatest story ever told historically, and a combination of both. So are we talking about rival stories? Is the notion that African people were slaves rather than captives the greatest story ever told? Or was the notion that Jesus was the Savior God instead of one of the 16 crucified Saviors?
That
Are they
Dr. Jackson
rival
talked
stories?
about.
Are they companion stories? Are they all part of the same propaganda machine that churns out theories and then spreads them to frame reality and give us a false sense of the composition of the world and of ourselves as a people?
Yeah.
I need Hunter.
Right, well, all right, go ahead.
Somebody.
No, I'm just saying you brought up the other stories that were
Well,
censored, right, during that time.
Yes.
And so one from the Nag Hammadi text
Yes.
found 1945 and
Yes,
1947
1945.
in Egypt, Kemet, right,
Yes.
where they put their scrolls in some jars and buried them. But who would have thought almost 2,000 years later they would turn up by accident? And in the Gospel of Thomas,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Which is not in the King James
Of course
version
not.
of the Bible.
Of course
So
not,
let's make
because
that
it has a different idea of divinity.
Right.
That the kingdom is within you.
Right.
Even our good friend, Miss Dorothy Tillman on the radio said Saturday that God is in the brain and the mind, right? And so that was the story, but that story was censored. It was censored. You can't, God has to be outside of everything. But how can that be? How can, quote, this deity, this creator be outside of his creation or its creation?
I would raise the question, how can God be outside and not inside if God
At
is
the same time.
omnipresent?
Yes. Yes.
If God is omnipresent, then he is equally present.
Everywhere.
I don't even like the pronoun he. But if God is omnipresent, God is equally present everywhere. That
But
would-
Dr. Peace, we have to be careful with that term,
All right.
God, right?
Well,
Because
I
it comes
understand
from-
that God is a common noun. It's part of a classification of a group. So you haven't really said anything, because if you have not,
But it's a German word.
if you don't give it a name, you know, if I walk out into the schoolyard and say boy, then everything that thinks it's male out there is going to respond to that. So if you walked out into a situation and said God, everything that thinks it's God is going to respond to that. So if you cannot identify and name, then you do not have a concept of a divinity. You just have a concept of a group which you have admitted by using the term God that you don't know anybody in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's the point. When he mentions Nag Hammadi, two things. One, in the Gospel of Thomas, it is true. Now, in the Coptic, and these texts are written in Coptic, the term for kingdom is a feminine term. And one of the more powerful texts in Nag Hammadi is Thunder Perfect Mind, which is all about the feminine nature of deity as feminine. Now, one of my things, there's an excellent book, Merlin Stone, When God Was a Woman.
Right.
I always like to point out to my students, when did God, when we use that term, become a man? When in most ancient cultures, even among certain early European cultures, they understood the nature that there was a direct relationship between reproduction from the earth and women. That's why in most
Right.
African societies, guess who went out and did the farming?
Right.
Women did. And many of those men who were brought here as captives were offended to have to go out into the fields and plant, because they believed that's women's work. And I think that that's a real problem. And most people don't want to talk about the fact that even this individual Jesus, guess who his number one supporters were? All women. All women. Nobody likes to see, because they like to pick and choose what they want to talk about, right? Instead of looking at the whole thing in context. They were all women. All those women supported him. You know, he was big pimping, as they like to say today. All right. Well, he was. All right.
Well, now you gotta decide whether or not you're going to have an historical Jesus, which we have not yet found, or you're going to have a biblical Jesus, in which you then have a person who is supported by women. So now you have to decide on whether or not that's going to be true for you as well. But the whole point is that these stories and opinions have had such a devastating influence on us because they obscure the truth. And when reality is obscured, so that you do not know who you are, where you are, what your purpose is, what your destiny is, then how do you function in truth? How do you function in terms of your purpose to know yourself, to know thyself? How does one get to know thyself when a false sense of thyself is presented? Always before you, a mirror image of yourself when you go to look in the mirror, there's already an image in it.
Right.
You never see yourself because there's an image already there.
That's by intent.
That's intentional.
So come on.
Yeah, it's we have to really learn language, right? And how language can manipulate us. Stephen K. Dick, you know, the great science fiction writer, he talks about how words can manipulate our consciousness and have us believing things when there's no factual basis for them. And so we have to pay very close attention to language. Like when someone says that when we think of black, and Dr. King said this, that we have to get the language straight. When we think black, we call up negative associations in our consciousness, in our semantic networks.
Because the language does it.
Because that's the language.
Yes.
When we think white, it calls up positive associations. Whether you believe it or not, you don't have to believe in white supremacy. But when you say white supremacy, for example, the corollary of that is what? Black inferiority.
Absolutely.
Even though, so you're still privileging whiteness with the term white supremacy. That's why I never use that term.
And, you know, that's interesting because when we go back to, what is it, about 1671 in Virginia, when they established the law, where they established whiteness as a law, they did that to juxtapose it against something else. And that something else was an idea of blackness. And
their idea of
black, right. And of course, it also was this opportunity, which we're still dealing with today, and most people don't know because they don't study the origin of ideas, of why it is that less well-off people who are classified as white in this country feels such an affinity to elites who are classified as whites in this country, in opposition to people who are called blacks in this country, because they serve as their middle functionaries for them. And of course, all this happens after Bacon's Rebellion.
Right.
You see, Bacon's Rebellion is one of those crucial events in American history that they don't ever like to talk about, because it was the disunifying factor of poor and so-called working class people, as they like to use, in this country against elites. And them people still doing the same thing. They talk to me. I mean, it amazes me how 45 gets into his thing, and I don't want to go into him right now because he's in a part of this. He's not the number one subject of this, but he's a part of the discussion because it's about propaganda.
Right.
All right. But here's what I wanted to point out too, right quick, is that when you look at the thinking of the founders, or as Dr. Francis Cress, or the late Dr. Francis Cress Wells used to refer to them as the fondlers, and you read their documents, they were deists. See, the notion that the United States was supposed to be a Christian country is false, and it's never been stated.
Never.
Because they were deists. Many of these people were Masons. They came out of that whole Enlightenment movement that that really is the foundation of what they call the Illuminati. I always like to tell my students, Illuminati means you're the enlightened ones compared to those who are not enlightened.
That's right.
And the truth of the matter is that these individuals were living on the idea of reason. And when you read the Declaration of Independence correctly, they clearly state that they refer to a creator. They don't refer to Jesus or to God, to a creator. This is very, very common Masonic language.
Right.
That is very important, and how you want to do it. They were not interested in having any kind of religious representation or authority in this country. That was not their program. But because people don't read those documents correctly or understand the background behind them or the people behind them. When you're looking at even the people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Young and some of these other individuals and read their writings, they're not trying to push a Christian idea, but see, people who don't read, and most people don't read, it's the people who, it's like people who, I always tell my students all the time that, people still looking at pictures in the Bible. They don't read it. They're looking at the pictures. Or they'll look at the Ten Commandments and say, that's just how it went down.
But then they don't study. See, reading is one thing, studying is another. When you look and you say, well, when did they get semicolons? Back ages ago, they had this punctuation. They had colons and semicolons and commas and all of this. And if you move punctuations around, you can get an entirely different meaning. Once I embarked upon that, but it just was taking too much time. But I embarked upon that, putting a period here, taking a comma out there and letting it continue. It's amazing how just, if you talk about language and changing words and changing the meaning, if you would be amazed at how inserting punctuation in places alters entirely what a group of words would say. So you've got a problem with the language. You have a problem with the culture. You have a problem with the concepts that grow out of both of those. And here we are, captive people who were never slaves, but who are behaving very much like it, because I think probably if you get called out of your name so long, I look at the indigenous people of this country and I look at them call themselves Indians now. It amazes me because I couldn't imagine. They never called themselves that when they were the original people.
Miami.
They
were the Choctaw. They
All
were
of
the
that.
Algonquins. They were the Blackfoot. They were all the other Navajos. They were people with names, and now they are Indians.
Right. Well, that
I think the generations that are not taught by their elders, that are separated and educated outside of the community, now, because they didn't get that connection, now see themselves as Indians and Native Americans. This was not even America.
Even when you take Haiti, for example.
We got 5 minutes, so we're going to take Haiti real quick.
Okay, this will be less than 1 minute. You had the French Revolution around the same time. You had the, quote, American Revolution at the same time. But it was only Haiti's 1805 Constitution that banned, quote, slavery and criminalized anyone who participated in that. They had a different notion of human rights. Right. And so we
They
have,
had a different notion of humans.
Yes.
exactly.
'Cause
And
we
that's what
weren't
we have to
considered
get
part
back
of
to.
that
Right.
group.
I agree.
And so I would ask your readers, please get this book here. It's called How Propaganda Works by Jason Stanley. He's at Yale University. It's a very powerful book that gives you the inner workings of how we're manipulated and tricked.
Well, I can tell you one thing.
Yes.
We are an example of how propaganda works.
Yes.
Because when you have become fictitious, when you have become so unlike yourself that you, as I say, when you look in the mirror, you do not know that that is not yourself in that mirror, that that is somebody's, that the man in the mirror is not you. So propaganda is alive and well.
It's working
and
well.
working in America.
Yes, it is. I would say that two things. One, whenever you look at a text of the Nag Hammadi text or the early biblical text in Greek or Hebrew, there is no punctuation. These ideas of verses, Medu Neter, Chinese, there is no punctuation. And so these ideas of verses and chapters and all this stuff comes up in the Middle Ages. And so just like Hunter, I want to encourage your audience if they want to get some good ideas. This is A History of the End of the World by Jonathan Kirsch, how the most controversial book in the Bible changed the course of Western civilization. And this one is called Longing for the End. By Friedrich J. Baumgartner, which is A History of Millennialism and Western Civilization. These are both excellent books on the history of that. And I have many more, but I just wanted to drop these right here.
Well, in order to read books, you have to give up something else. So I hope they don't give up the H3O show that brought you this message. But I thank you very much.
Thank you
Hunter,
for having me.
Havlin,
Thank you always.
Adams III, and Dr. Joseph Ben Levi, who I still claim, even though you all do sometimes get go off on your own and do stuff that you didn't ask my permission to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peace.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I love you.
Yeah. You are so funny sometimes, I'm telling you, man.